We have international affairs analyst Dan Perry joining us, and Shiri Fine-Grossman, the former head of regional affairs at the Israel National Security Council. Undoubtedly, one of the major fears that the Islamic Republic had in regards to what kind of a retaliatory attack we could see from the State of Israel. But what was the real decision-making behind that decision? Was it the U.S. pushing Israel too hard, per se?
I don't know if it's too hard, but you clearly had two competing timelines. One was the time frame within which Israel felt it needed to respond, and the other was the imperative felt by the American administration currently in power that nothing that seems escalatory and particularly risky and brazen on Israel's part happen before the election, because any such thing would risk Kamala Harris's prospects both in Michigan and in Pennsylvania. And if she loses either, never mind both, she's lost the election. So it's a bit awkward that the U.S. politics entered the equation, but they did. And because of that, they basically pressured Israel not to attack the nuclear sites or the oil sites. But does Israel care
for the Democratic administration to remain in power?
Well,
I mean, that of course
first
is
of
one
all,
of the questions.
Biden remains in power until January 21st. I don't want him to be an enemy because Israel needs UN support, U.S. support, both for munitions and for the international cover at the UN and elsewhere. Secondly, Harris might win. And then, good Lord, I mean, you could be looking at 4 or 8 years of unfriendliness coming from the White House. But I do think the result of that weirdness was something that is arguably optimal, moderate, measured, and wise, because Israel achieved a whole number of goals with this action. A, it hit certain targets that were basically weapons manufacturing targets and military targets. B, it killed no civilians and so created no weakness that way. C, showed they have the intel and the execution abilities. And last but maybe mainly, played nice with the Americans. Now, they also enabled the Iranian regime plausible deniability to be able to say that it's no big deal and therefore they don't need to respond, which is another interest of Israel.
Right. Well,
because no one wants an escalation here. I want to add one thing, though. I would hope that in exchange for Israel's clear acquiescence to what the U.S. asked for, the U.S. will be sympathetic to what I think not only Israel needs, but the world needs, which is after November 6th, a complete paradigm shift where the world, led by the U.S., approaches a now weakened Iran, a chastened Iran, and basically says the game is over with the proxies, with the nukes, etc., and backs that up with military action.
Right. I'd like to kind of refer to something you said there. We saw a Washington Post report coming out saying that Israel was, essentially making the choice to downplay or ensure that Iran had the ability to downplay the severity of Israel's attacks on its military infrastructure.
Because what advantage is there of Israel to humiliate them publicly? More important that they know that Israel knows where to hit, is able to hit, and has exposed the fact of this massive asymmetry. Whereas Iran needed to flood the zone with 200 ballistic missiles and hit almost nothing. Israel does pinpoint attacks and suffers no consequences, because Iran seemingly has very little air defenses and no air force.
Well, a chorus of international voices are already coming out to address the attacks. Germany and the UK are urging Iran not to respond, saying that now is the time for a de-escalation. Egypt, Russia, and Afghanistan are condemning the Israeli strike, saying they could further destabilize the region. And Saudi Arabia has also condemned the targeting of Iran in a statement this morning, but interestingly failed to mention Israel by name. I'd like to turn to our guests in the studio. We have international affairs analyst Dan Perry still with us, and Shiri Fine-Grossman, the former head of regional affairs at the Israel National Security Council. All right, so Dan, I'm going to turn to you first. How can we interpret the international response that we're seeing to Israel's strikes against Iran this morning?
The Sunni moderate Arab countries are cowards. Simple as that. Israel's being asked to make some sacrifices, certainly from the perspective of the current government, in order to enable a grand strategic umbrella with these countries against Iran, but they don't have the courage of their conviction to simply state the truth, which is that they, like Israel, would like the power of Iran's Islamic theocracy diminished, and if at all possible, regime change in Iran. They're lying in the same way that Mahmoud Abbas was lying when he said a week and some days ago that Sinwar was something like a great patriot and a martyr. And it's complete nonsense. It's mendacity It's pitiful. I wish I could say something other than that, but it's clear the alternative is to think that they would rather Israel did not retaliate and they support Iran over Israel, which I think we know is untrue. So that's where we stand, and this is the
Saudi
argument.
Arabia-
I can't believe it. I'm going to disagree with Dan. This is the first, I think, on the channel. Look, they have a tough game to play. Their home crowd, their publics, really does not fond of the normalization with Israel. UAE, Bahrain, others. It's really, and Egypt and Jordan. It's really causing them internal frictions and disagreement with the governments. And their number one agenda, and has always been, and I think we just need to play into that, is keeping their governments and regimes in place, and anything to risk that they will avoid. And so, from twofold, if Israel is really unpopular and everybody's watching Al Jazeera and seeing what's going on in Gaza and view that as unproportional, they can't go against their public on the one side. And on the other side, they're scared of Iran, and rightly so. They're very close to Iran. They are very vulnerable.
Tell Arab is a river, basically.
And so it has to do with the Arab culture. You have to read into those statements accordingly. So
absolutely.
I mean, I don't think they're cowards. I think the fact that they haven't severed ties with Israel up till now is kind of very surprising.
I give them credit for that, but when I say they're cowards, it's because of what you yourself are saying. I have to disagree with their claims of disagreeing. we in fact agree. The Arab street does not view this with favor. And they are afraid to tell their publics the truth for fear of undermining their brittle and basically largely illegitimate rule to begin with. They do have some influence, and if they spoke the truth to their public, that could change the nature of their public. The public isn't used to hearing a message of truth from their own leadership.
I think they are, but in their way.
You know, the decision not to mention Israel by name on the part of Saudi Arabia in the statement that they released this morning, and also the UAE, was certainly an interesting one. I mean, what do you think that means?
The same waffle that we're talking about.
Yeah, it's exactly.
They don't want to be so hypocritical as to condemn Israel, but they want to throw a bone to their publics because they're afraid of their publics, even though they're police states. The whole structure is a little bit pitiful. It would be nice to see some courage and to see some truth.
There seems to be overall support for the decision. Obviously, the opposition leaders and officials in the government don't seem to be as happy. What is your take on this?
The opposition, there needs to be an opposition, and Yair Lapid chose to give voice to those who wanted a stronger action. But we discussed just earlier in the show why there were good reasons. At this point, given the imperative of not going into a major conflict with the American administration, to hold off on a major action. So, you know what? I would tell the opposition, focus on bringing down the government.
Israeli authorities continue to say how UNRWA is explicitly involved in this terror activity inside the Gaza Strip. The prime example, another one being this week, when first the IDF says that they eliminated one of the leaders of the Al-Baraj Hamas battalion who led the infiltration into this roadside bombing in Kibbutz Re'im, where they threw this grenade inside. 16 people were killed. This was the area where 4 Israelis were kidnapped, including Hirsch Goldberg, Poland. So they brought him to justice, and then it was a few days later that UNRWA did confirm he was a part of their operation since 2022, for years. So this is all stated in the record books. This is another example that Israel continues to say why they can no longer work hand in hand with UNRWA if they're going to be complicit in this terror activity.
Right. Dan, I'd like to ask you your take on this. Why get rid of UNRWA now? I mean, for years, we know that Israel has been wanting to get rid of the organization, accusing it of collaborating with Hamas. What has changed in this given moment?
A lot of things are wrong with UNRWA, from the perpetuation of infinite refugee status for multiple generations to the educational system, where UNRWA has played along with a system that basically indoctrinates the youth into jihadism, to evidence that certain UNRWA employees were complicit in Hamas activities. All that is clear, but the Israeli government has been very much guilty of having no plausible strategy for Gaza in a day after Hamas. And you have to ask yourself, organizations can be reformed. Do you really want to eliminate UNRWA when the implication would be that the state of Israel would then have to be providing all these social services to 2.5 million Palestinians in Gaza? Mm-hmm. It is obviously unwise, and the aggressive way in which they're pursuing this, absent the creation of an alternative, which they could do, for example, with the Palestinian Authority, is part and parcel of Israel's disastrous lack of strategy in Gaza.
Right. So, Shiri, what would the replacement be? Who could effectively take over for UNRWA operations?
Well, I think it's a tactical question, and the strategic question is the important one. So what are the options? The option one is that Israel has to step in and take all the duties an occupier, from a military perspective, has to do. Option two is to bring replacements. Well, up to now, all the negotiations that we're talking about, the UAE coming in and other players, just didn't pan out because Israel was not willing to get to a ceasefire, which will in turn release the hostages as well. So it's not an UNRWA question on what happens with UNRWA. It's more a strategic question about what the Israeli government wants to do with Gaza. And I believe, up to now, this is how we got to October 7. That Prime Minister Netanyahu, and I've been there, I just refused to have any sort of debate of what's the future of Gaza.
All right. I think this is a good transition to our next story here. Is the Israeli government going to make it another 2 years? Well, new polls that have just been released by Israel's Channel 12 News show that public confidence in Prime Minister Netanyahu is low and that most Israelis favor early elections. 51% of respondents say that elections should be held as soon as possible, while 39% want to wait until the next general elections. Those are slated to formally take place in October of 2026. That would be 2 years from now. Dan, I'm going to turn to you on this. I mean, also, Shiri, you just mentioned this yourself, right? The kind of lack of a strategic plan for the future post-war Gaza. What do you think has essentially led to the lack of support for Netanyahu that we're seeing in these polls, especially given the fact that it appeared that what took place in Lebanon and the targeting of Hamas, of course, the pager beeper targeted, intelligence attack that took out so many Hezbollah fighters was a major win for the Prime Minister and his government.
You have to remember, this government was preceded by like 4 elections that were basically different versions of a tie, as was the 2022 election, essentially. Netanyahu had the support of maybe half the people, barely. Now, his entire term in office, since assuming office in December 2022, has been an almost unprecedented calamity, and many of their policies, like formalizing the Haredi draft exemption, are opposed by a majority of Israelis. And their attempt to kneecap Israeli democracy created such furor in the country that the entire security establishment was saying we're going to be attacked because we're projecting weakness, and that happened. The debacle of October 7th in any parliamentary democracy, a reasonable one, where the leadership had a shred of dignity, would have led to a resignation. Netanyahu is hanging on in hopes of somehow changing the narrative, making people forget, bringing successes to the table, as they've done in the past month or two, to turn that around. Back in October a year ago, 2/3 to 3/4 of the people said they want immediate new elections. Right now, it's 50 more percent versus 39%. That shows that he remains unpopular, but his strategy of playing for time and assuming that his coalition of 64 out of 120 in a Knesset are basically a bunch of lemmings who, if he said, I need you to vote that 2 + 2 is 57, they would. He's assuming this will enable him to survive a bit longer in power, hanging on like a man possessed, to the point where the narrative is different. A war against Iran, something to do with Trump, and so forth. And October 7th will be forgotten. That's what we're looking at. But at the moment, he still doesn't want elections because he probably still would lose the elections, but he would not be crushed the way he would have been last October and November.
All right, Shiri, what's your take? You got 30 seconds here.
I think I agree with Dan because the polls actually show that Netanyahu's strategy is working. He was very unpopular right after October 7th.
And now he's just unpopular.
Right, and now he's just unpopular, which is like turning back the clock. So we're back to be very polarized, like they are in the U.S., and we're half split. And you see this in Britain, and you see this in Turkey, and you see this in France, and you see this in such other places. And I think it's a global phenomenon, and it's not just a local phenomenon.
Quite remarkable.